Hello, and welcome back to the Great Aspirations ACT Prep series. In this video, I'm going to do a walkthrough for the first reading section, the first reading practice section. And as I do that walkthrough, I'm going to go through all the problems, and moreover, I'm going to go through the strategies that I would implement I um, as I went through this section. Just for ease of following, I may do the questions in a slightly different order. Um, I may try to keep the questions around each passage together. So I might do all the questions from passage 1, then 2, then 3, then 4. But I will make a note every time that I would skip something. Every time I would do something out of order, I will make sure to tell you about that. I'm also not going to do these passages in personal order of difficulty for me. I think that is a decision that you need to make for yourself, and that's not something that I can recommend for you. But I am going to look through the passages just first of all and see which ones I think might be difficult for different reasons. So without further ado, let's get into these sections. And I want to start by looking at what is on these passages. So of course we have the normal 4 passages. We have literary narrative, which looks to be quite a long passage at 120 lines. And we have natural science, which is also quite long, not as long. We have social science. Social science is about the internet, which is sort of exciting to me. Maybe I'll enjoy that one first. Which is also quite long, and humanities, which is much shorter, but this one seems like it could be quite difficult. Um, so for me, I think that I would probably do this third passage first because it would be easy for me. I think reading about the internet is something that I would want to do. But if that's not something that you would want to do, you should start with whatever you think would be easier. So for the purpose of this walkthrough, I'm going to start with passage 1, and then we can move on from there with the questions about this passage. So the literary narrative passage, number 1, which is adapted from the Magnificent Ambersons by Booth Tarkington. When Mr. George Amberson Minifer came home for the holidays at Christmastide in his sophomore year, probably no great change had taken place inside him, but his exterior was visibly altered. Nothing about him encouraged any hope that he had received his comeuppance. On the contrary, the yearners for that stroke of justice must yearn even more itchingly. The gilded youth's manner had become polite, but his politeness was a kind which democratic people found hard to bear. Cards were out for a ball in his honor, and this pageant of the tenantry was held in the ballroom of the Amberson mansion the night after his arrival. It was, as Mrs. Henry Franklin Foster said of Isabel's wedding, a big Amberson-style thing. Though that wise Mrs. Henry Franklin Foster had long ago gone the way of all wisdom, having stepped out of the Midland town, unquestionably into heaven. A long step, but not beyond her powers. She had successors, but no successor. The town having grown too large to confess that it was intellectually led and literarily authoritated by one person. And some of these successors were not invited to the ball, for dimensions were now so metropolitan that intellectual leaders and literary authorities loomed in outlying regions unfamiliar to the Ambersons. However, all old citizens recognizable as gentry received cards, and of course, so did their dancing descendants. The orchestra and the caterer were brought from far away, in the Amberson manner, though this was really a gesture, perhaps one more of a habit than ostentation, for servitors of gaiety as proficient as these importations were nowadays to be found in the town. Even flowers and plants and roped vines were brought in from afar. Not, however, until the stock of the local florists proved insufficient to obliterate the interior structure of the big house in the Amberson way. It was the last of the great long-remembered dances that everybody talked about. There were getting to be so many people in town that no later the next year there were too many for everybody to hear of even such a ball as the Ambersons. George, white-gloved with a gardenia in his buttonhole, stood with his mother and the Major, embowered in a big red and gold drawing-room downstairs, to receive the guests, and, standing thus together, the trio offered a picturesque example of good looks persistent through 3 generations. The Major, his daughter, and his grandson were of a type all Amberson, tall, straight, and regular, with dark eyes, short noses, good chins. And the grandfather's expression, no less than the grandson's, was one of faintly amused condescension. There was a difference, however. The grandson's unlined young face had nothing to offer except this condescension. The grandfather's had other things to say. It was a handsome, worldly old face, conscious of its importance, but persuasive rather than arrogant, and not without tokens of sufferings withstood. The Major's short white hair parted in the middle, like his grandson's, and in all he stood as briskly equipped to the fashion as exquisite young George. Isabel, standing between her father and her son, caused a vague amazement in the mind of the latter. Her age, just under 40, was for George a thought of something as remote as moons of Jupiter. He could not possibly have conceived such an age ever coming to be his own. 5 years was the limit of his thinking time. 5 years ago he had been a child not yet 14, and those 5 years were an abyss. 5 years hence he knew he would be almost 24, what the girls he knew called one of the older men. He could imagine himself at 24, but beyond that his powers staggered and refused the task. He saw little essential difference between 38 and 88, and his mother was to him not a woman, but wholly a mother. He had no perception of her other than as an adjunct to himself, his mother. Nor could he imagine her thinking or doing anything, falling in love, walking with a friend, or reading a book, as a woman, and not as his mother. The woman, Isabel, was a stranger to her son, as completely a stranger as if he had never in his life seen her or heard her voice. And it was tonight, while he stood with her, receiving, that he caught a disquieting glimpse of this stranger whom he thus fleetingly encountered for the first time. Youth cannot imagine romance apart from youth. That is why the roles of heroes and heroines of plays are given by the managers to most youthful actors they can find among the competent. Both middle-aged people and young people enjoy a play about young lovers, but only middle-aged people will tolerate a play about middle-aged lovers. Young people will not come to see such a play, because for them, middle-aged lovers are a joke, not a very funny one. Therefore, to bring both the middle-aged people and the young people into this house, the manager makes his romance as young as he can. Youth will indeed be served, and its profound instinct is to be not only scornfully amused, but vaguely angered by middle-age romance. So, standing beside his mother, George was disturbed by a sudden impression coming upon him out of nowhere, so far as he could detect, that her eyes were brilliant, that she was graceful and youthful, in a word, that she was romantically lovely. Okay, what a passage. What a passage. A difficult one, I think, in terms of some of the sentence structures, in terms of the sort of ideas that we're discussing, there isn't much plot for a literary narrative passage. Oftentimes you'll have some more plot and you'll have some more dialogue, and this is much denser than some literary narrative passages. But I think we have enough to go on, and I don't think we need to really mark this up. We have a sort of structure that we've established in our head. We have this sort of opening idea about the Ambersons. If I had to write out a little structure, I would say, number one, we have the Ambersons. We have the Ambersons. We just have a little bit about what they're like, what this ball, and what this ball is about. And just sort of anything about the family. And then we have George, right? We have George, who, I think is sort of our main character, if we have a main character. And then we have this realization, which isn't really a third point, it's more of a sub-point to the second point. But I think if we're going to have a nice 3-point structure, which I think is what we need for any reading passage, this is what I am going to come up with. And again, you don't need to write this out every time. If you have a strong structure in your head, then you are perfectly fine to go on with the passage, as long as you have sort of a structure that you have derived from the passage itself. So, okay, we have a passage that we've read. We have a good structure in our heads. Let's move on to some of these questions. Let's see what's going on. So we have a main point, a main theme, main purpose, for example. We have a detail. We have author's portrayal. We have a detail. We have purpose of a paragraph. We have a detail. We have a detail. We have a detail. We have a vocabulary. And we have a purpose of a phrase. Okay, simple enough. Let's get through. Well, actually, let's get through these referential passages, because these referential questions, meaning these ones with line numbers, because I think those will give us an opportunity to read back into the passage a little bit more. So starting with question 9, as used in line 40, the word obliterate most nearly means. And again, vocabulary, we always need to look back at how it's used in context, because it's never going to be, or very, very rarely going to be, exactly how you think that word should be used. So the sentence, even flowers and plants and roped vines were brought in from afar. Not, however, until the stock of the local florists proved insufficient to obliterate the interior structure of the big house. Okay, so obviously it's not literal. We're not trying to destroy this house with flowers. That would be kind of absurd, right? So these ideas, these literal definitions, A and B, destroy and dismantle, don't make sense. We know that the Ambersons aren't trying to completely wreck their house. And obliterate most nearly means decorate or fill. Now that seems interesting. Well, when we look back at how this is used, we realize that in the Amberson way. What do we mean to obliterate in the Amberson way? I think this is sort of key to understanding whether it's to decorate or to fill. And I don't know that it's necessarily to fill everything. We actually don't really have a clear sense of what in the Amberson way is supposed to mean at a granular level. Okay, we understand that the Ambersons are over the top. We understand that they go too far, and that they have this sort of gaudy, overproduced event that they're throwing. But we don't know that they absolutely fill everything. So to me, the best answer seems to be to decorate. Obviously, they're just trying to decorate this house, and to fill seems like something that isn't totally supported by the passage. Although it does seem like there's a chance that the Ambersons do try to fill their entire house with all of these plants and flowers and such. But okay, I think the answer is answer choice C. And if we check back the way that we normally check back, Not, however, until the stock of the local florists proved insufficient to decorate the interior structure of the big house in the typical Amberson way. Yeah, I like that. I'm sticking with it. Okay, and the other referential question, the purpose of the phrase. The author uses the phrase an adjunct to himself in line 88 to mean that, okay, let's find it. Let's find line 88, which is right here. Here is our line, an adjunct to himself. He had no perception of her mother than as an adjunct to himself, which this should say his. He had no perception of his mother. He had no perception of his mother other than as an adjunct to himself. His mother, nor could he of his excuse me. He had no perception of his mother other than as an adjunct to himself, his mother. Nor could he imagine her thinking or doing anything as a woman and not as his mother. Right? Thinking or doing anything as a woman and not as his mother. So this to me means that he can imagine his mother as his mother, but he doesn't understand her as her own person. Right? So we don't know that Isabel is a devoted mother, for one thing. That seems overly simplistic. And we also don't know that George relies heavily upon his mother. He could imagine her this way and still not rely upon her at all. The major does not value women's independence is one of those absolutely wacky answers. It has nothing to do with what we're talking about because we're talking about George. The major's mother isn't a part of this entire passage. So that leaves answer choice C, which says that George has never considered his mother as a person independent of himself. And that seems true, right? We're saying he understands Isabel as his mother. He doesn't understand Isabel as a woman in her own right. So C seems absolutely true. He's never thought about her as an independent person. Okay, so let's get through some detailed questions now because those will give us a better chance to look back through the passage. Again, we're going through this process of answering these questions as we are reviewing the passage. And I think the detailed questions are going to help us sort of bolster and fill out this structure that we've established in our heads so that we can answer these purpose of paragraph questions later on. And the narrator question as well. So compared to George, the major is kinder, taller, more nuanced, better dressed. These are some interesting options. For one thing, it doesn't seem obvious that George is kinder. We don't see acts of kindness from either George or the major. So this seems difficult to stress. But let's, and same with sort of taller and better dressed, these all seem sort of difficult to support based on the passage. My immediate impression is that it should be more nuanced. And the reason why I think that is, again, we have George, right? George is our second part of the structure. So I'm looking sort of in the middle, starting with this part, which is where George is. And the comparison to the major. Well, it kind of seems like they're dressed the same way, all three in a line. The major are both tall, so we don't know how tall they are, but we know they're both tall. They have sort of these same facial features, but here's the key sentence. There was a difference. The grandson had nothing but condescension. The grandfather had other things to say. Not that he doesn't have condescension, but he has other things to say. And this, to me, this part in lines 60 through 62 or 3, say, really supports this idea that that the major is more nuanced than George, right? They seem to be the same height. We don't really know whether they're kinder or taller. We also don't know whether they're the same height, but we know they're both tall. And we don't really have much to say about who is dressed better. The impression seems like they're standing as a family, they're probably dressed about the same. But again, we don't really know. More nuanced seems directly supported. George is just straight condescension. That's what is sort of in his head. And the major has a lot more going on. So, okay, I'm happy with that answer. Let's move on to some other detail questions. According to the passage, the Ambersons' flowers are bought, excuse me. And we know because we already did our referential vocabulary question exactly where we need to find this. Where are the flowers bought? Well, we remember it's right here in line 40. And even the flowers and plants and roped vines were brought in from afar. Brought in from afar. Brought in from afar. Actually, crucially, not until the stock of the local florists proved insufficient. Not until the stock of the local florists were proved insufficient. So we can eliminate a bunch of these only from local sources. Only from local sources. From a single florist, well, we don't know how many florists there were. It seems likely that the local sources had many florists and that afar there were also many florists, so we don't seem to know that there's only one florist. Only from afar, or both from local sources and from afar. And to me, it seems like what the passage is trying to say is that they're both from local sources and from afar, right? The local stock proved insufficient. They bought everything, they tried it out, and they saw whether it would completely decorate the house. And what they found was that it wasn't enough. So they had to buy more flowers from afar. So it's not only from afar. Another detailed question. According to the passage, the ball is thrown, annually according to tradition, in honor of George's grandfather for the major's birthday or to celebrate George's return. I think the ball is about George. I think that everything is about George in this passage, really. That's really what the centerpiece of this whole passage is. So I'm immediately drawn toward answer choice D. But we know that the Ambersons and the ball is in the first part, right? It's the first part of our structure. So let's just come up through the top. So George returns at Christmas time. Fine. Cards were out for a ball in his honor. So there's our answer. The ball is in his answer, his being not the major's, his being George. So we know for a fact that it is George's return. It's not for the major. It's also not in honor of George's grandfather. And it's also, as far as we know, not annual. It seems like maybe George does come home every year and does have a ball every year, but we don't know. We can't support that answer. It's also worth noting that B and C are potentially equivalent. These are potentially equivalent answer choices. Because a birthday party for George's grandfather being the major, would honor the major, right? So these could be the same. If it was for the major's birthday, then it would necessarily be in honor of George's grandfather. So you have to be careful with these answer choices. Another detailed question, according to the passage, right? We know it's a detailed question. Young people do not what? And so my immediate recall of where we discuss what young people do, and particularly as they compare to middle-aged people, is that we were comparing the sort of the choices that a play manager could make, right? This playwriter wanted to write a play about young lovers because everyone would enjoy that, but young people wouldn't enjoy a play about middle-aged lovers. So I'm immediately drawn to answer choice A. But if we want to really look at this, young people do not what? Well, this was in George's realization, right? George being the young person, what's going on in his head? That's the realization. And in fact, it's right here. Youth cannot imagine romance apart from youth, right? Both middle-aged people and young people enjoy a play about young lovers. Okay, I remembered that right. But only middle-aged people will tolerate a play about middle-aged lovers, right? Only middle-aged people. Only middle-aged people. So we know that if only middle-aged people enjoy a play about young lovers, young people will not enjoy a play about middle-aged lovers. And again, we can eliminate a lot of these answer choices pretty quickly. Attend lavish parties. Well, George is young and had a lavish party. Grow more mature at university. This doesn't seem like it's anywhere in the passage. Maybe George has failed to grow more mature, but saying that young people don't grow more mature at university doesn't seem like is what is being said in this passage, or understand the lives of their elders. This one seems potentially possible, but I would really caution against an answer choice like this. And the reason for that is that um, we actually see in this last paragraph, we start to see George understanding his mother um, being his elder, of course, right? We start to see George understanding this. George was disturbed by a sudden impression coming upon out of her that her eyes were brilliant and that she was graceful and youthful, right? This last paragraph, this last part of this last paragraph is in contrast, with this part of the paragraph before it. George had never considered his mother before, but aha, now he does. Now he does consider his mother as a person separate from himself. And by drawing this contrast, we start to see that George is actually starting to understand the life of his mother, or starting to understand her as a person anyway. So D doesn't seem to be contradicted necessarily, but the passage sort of wants to hint against answer choice D here. And for that reason, I think we can eliminate it. Obviously, answer choice A is directly supported by the passage, but answer choice D is sort of tempting. It is sort of tempting, but we cannot answer it. Okay, we have 4 questions left. These are slightly more difficult. And notice that as we've done these questions, we've really gotten a better understanding of what's going on in the passage, right? We have a better understanding of the structure. We have this device that we've just discussed about how the author draws a contrast between these 2 paragraphs, between these 2 points in George's life and his psyche. So we're really starting to get a better understanding of the passage as a whole, and that's going to help us answer these remaining 4 questions. Especially this one. The author portrays George as what? Again, this isn't something that we really need to refer back to the passage as. Empathetic and family-oriented, well, I don't think so. He says that he doesn't understand his mother, right? It doesn't seem like he has a lot of understanding, and it doesn't seem like he has particular care for his family. It sounds like he's very sort of self-centered. Wise beyond his years, he seems like a typical 19-year-old. It sounds like he's sort of in line with this last paragraph where the author says that youth don't really appreciate middle-aged love. Sounds like he's more or less in line with that. Cynical and dismissive, I think, is totally unsupported. I don't think that there's any cynicism to be found. But naive and self-centered seems pretty much right. George is condescending. George has never thought about his mother before, right? It sounds like George is really looking out for number 1. It doesn't hurt. And in fact, right, self-centered being, he can't really imagine a life outside of his own. He can't imagine being older or younger. He has a very easy time thinking about who he is right now, as evidenced by this part of the passage. And so that's really a strike against him being empathetic or wise, and really a point toward him being naive and self-centered. Okay, so now we're getting a much better handle on everything that's going on in the passage. Let's look at this question too. The narrator of the passage can be described as what? A first-person narrator? No, obviously not. A first-person narrator says, I do this, I think that, I said this, and obviously not. right? We don't even need to read the rest of this. And the remaining three options are omniscient narrators, who primarily confers past events, who discusses multiple characters and events, or who focuses solely on the thoughts and feelings of one character. Well, who confers past events? Past events. It seems like it isn't necessarily just about events, right? If we're going to contrast answer choice B about past events and answer choice D, which has to do with the thoughts and feelings, it seems like there is thought and feeling to be had here, but there's also events. And so answer choice B and D both seem like they're not quite enough. You know, who primarily confers past events, it seems like we're also discussing characters and we're discussing thoughts and feelings, and that doesn't seem to be totally captured in this idea of conferring past events. And likewise, we are discussing more than one character, right? We are discussing what's going on inside the house in the mind of the major. We're discussing the Amberson family in general, and we're discussing even the town that the Ambersons live in. So saying that this is about one character is just not supported by this passage. An omniscient narrator who discusses multiple characters and events seems right. You know, we're discussing the return of George Amberson, which seems to be the main thing, but we also have some discussion of past things, past balls that they've thrown in particular. We have discussion of we have discussion of getting these plants, of organizing everything. We have of them standing there. And to be honest, this is probably the best answer because it's the vaguest. You know, you might be inclined when you're answering a lot of these questions to look at the most specific answer. And specific answers have an easy time being wrong because they need a very specific passage. But a vague or general answer, like answer choice C, has an easier time being right. Multiple characters and events doesn't tell you that much about what's going on in the passage. But there are multiple characters and events in the passage. Meanwhile, someone that solely focuses, as in answer choice D, solely focuses on the thoughts and feelings of one character, that's a very specific type of passage and one that you won't run into very often. So I think even just on probability, we can mark answer choice C. But of course, reading back through the passage, we can really figure out what is going on with it. And that it is an omniscient narrator, and that narrator does discuss, at the very least, multiple characters and events. Okay, so let's go through answer choice, question 5. And this is a referential question. It does say lines 32 through 47. But the reason why I leave a main purpose of a paragraph question until almost the end is that you need to understand the passage as a whole. And you need to understand how that paragraph fits into the passage. So as we're building the context with our earlier questions, as we're sort of gathering more details and making a bigger structure in our mind, we'll have a better idea of how this paragraph fits into that whole thing. And that's really why I think this needs to be toward the end of how you tackle these passages. So anyway, the purpose of the third paragraph, lines 32 through 47. Let's find lines 32 through 47. Here's line 32, 31, 32, through 47, which is at the end. It's this paragraph that spans these columns. And we've already read this. We've already looked over this, actually. And we see that it's about how the Ambersons like to decorate and how they like to throw these big parties, that they're big, they're ostentatious, they're over the top, and that everybody seems to hear about them, right? They're the talk of the town. They like to be this center of attention sort of parties. Okay, so we have a sense of what that paragraph says. Now let's figure out how it fits into the passage as a whole. Describing the process of buying flowers is one thing that the third paragraph does, but I don't see it being the main purpose. right? I think we're looking at how the Ambersons are as people. And especially if we remember the sort of structure that we want to think, the first part of our structure is about the Ambersons and the ball. We're learning what kinds of people they are. It's not really about the flower buying process. Demonstrating the Ambersons' gaudiness seems like a fantastic answer choice, right? We're learning that they need to decorate in such a way. They don't have enough flowers in the entire town to really adorn their house the way that they need to. You know, if we're going to use a word like obliterate, as we did in this question, then we understand that gaudiness is what we're after, right? We're demonstrating what kind of people the Ambersons are, and namely that they are over the top, they are gaudy in the way that they throw these parties, at least. Illustrating the Ambersons' home to the reader is again something that happens in this paragraph, but I wouldn't call it the main purpose. I wouldn't call it the main purpose because we're not really trying to establish a huge setting. What we're trying to do is we're trying to learn what kind of people they are. The passage as a whole is about people. The passage is about the choices that people make and what is important to those people, right? What they're thinking about, what their awareness is. The Ambersons value this thing. That's what we're learning. We're not really learning what their house looks like. We're learning that they like to be the center of attention, that they like to throw this kind of party that, conveys a specific image about who they are. So the home is not really an important point, except in that the home shows how gaudy the Ambersons are. So this is a supporting point to point B, right? Answer choice C is a supporting point to the main purpose of the paragraph. Setting up later plot points is one of those answer choices that is totally off the wall. I don't know where it comes from. I don't know how it could possibly be the answer choice, because there isn't a later plot point that really hinges upon having a lot of flowers, right? I think that's the entire content, or for everyone having been there. In fact, I wouldn't really describe this passage as having plot points in a proper sense. And finally, we get to the main purpose of the passage. And I want to note that this is a good time to answer the main purpose, or a main theme in this case, a main theme as it's worded in this question. This is a good time as you've gone over the passage multiple times in order to answer all of the other questions, and you have the best sense of what the passage as a whole does. That's the best time to do the main theme or main purpose questions. They put them first because the ACT likes to do stuff like that. I honestly don't know why, but they're not trying to help you. The more that you've reviewed the passage, the more that you've gone back over it, the more that you've thought about how all the pieces of the passage fit together, the better sense you're going to have about these main themes and main purposes. And that's when you have the best chance of answering this quickly and correctly. So anyway, my own little strategy rant aside, which one is the best expression of the main theme? Young people cannot imagine middle-aged romances, riches do not guarantee wisdom, celebration balls are often the most lavish, and family can sometimes be surprising. Well, I think young people not being able to imagine middle-aged romances is a point, is a theme in this passage, but I wouldn't say that it's a main theme, right? It's this weird aside, especially here in these lines, sort of 85 to 95. But this is really mostly, as we discussed earlier, a device for explaining what's going on with George as he's having this realization, as he is starting to be able to imagine what's going on in his mother's head, or, what her experience might be like outside of being his mother. And so I don't think that this is the main purpose, right? Again, a main theme needs to span the entire passage, and this just doesn't. This is just a few sentences, 2 or 3 sentences that is all inside of one paragraph. Riches do not guarantee wisdom seems like something that we could take away from this passage, right? I think if we want to look back at our structure, we understand that the Ambersons are rich. That is something that I think we really start to understand. People that have ballrooms and that can import flowers and can throw these big parties and have an orchestra and a caterer are certainly rich, right? I think there's no question. And then we later see that George does not have a lot of wisdom, especially in the second part of the passage. George has no particular wisdom, right? George can dress up in a rich way, George can be from a rich family, but George can be pretty stupid. He can have condescension only in his head. He can never have thought about his mother as a person. He can't think about 5 years before or after when he is. Right? That's not wisdom. George does not have wisdom. And in fact, even later on, we're talking about what youth can't imagine. And so, points throughout the entire passage are really showing us that riches don't guarantee wisdom, right? We see that riches and wisdom are these two main ideas, and we're sort of fitting them together over the course of this entire passage. And that's what a main theme looks like. So for that reason, I think that it is the correct answer here. Celebration balls being the most lavish is kind of a silly answer choice. First of all, celebration balls, I don't know who's throwing a ball for a reason other than to celebrate. But we also don't have any comparison in the passage about which one is more or less lavish than others. So I think C is totally out there. Family can sometimes be surprising. Again, you could say that this bit about, from lines sort of 115 to 120, you could say that this part is a surprise to George and actually a surprise from his family. But I don't think that's the main purpose of the passage. Just using our rule of thumb, it's only part of this one paragraph. Otherwise, there's no surprise to be had at any point in the passage. So for that reason, I think D is also wrong. So there is our passage. I think we've gotten all of the questions, and I'm pretty confident in all of the answers. Passage 2 is about natural science, which is taken from the article Boiling Water at Hot Creek by the U.S. Geologic Survey. In the Hot Creek geologic site, located in a narrow gorge 8 miles or 12 kilometers east of the town of Mammoth Lakes, numerous hot springs flow into a snowmelt-friend stream. The area is managed by the U.S. Forest Service as a geologic interpretive site and has been a popular recreational area for fishing, swimming, hiking, birdwatching, and photography. The U.S. Geological Survey, USGS, has long monitored the spring activity, water temperatures and chemistry, and stream flow as a part of a program that seeks to better understand volcanic unrest and possible geologic hazards throughout the region. The attractions of Hot Creek, however, also harbor danger. The locations, discharge rates, and temperatures of springs often change. The larger and more vigorous springs flow from fractures in the volcanic rock, altered rhyolite, in Hot Creek Gorge. When fractures become sealed by mineral deposition, spring discharge and temperature decline. When new fractures develop or sealed fractures reopen, spring discharge and temperatures can increase suddenly. Rock fracturing happens because the thermal area lies within a region of frequent earthquakes and active ground uplift, deformation. The changes in the locations and vigor of springs can be sudden and dangerous to unprepared visitors, especially if they stray beyond walkways and fences. Since May 2006, springs in and near the most popular swimming areas have been geysering, or intermittently spurting very hot, sediment laden water as high as 6 feet, or 2 meters, above the stream surface. At times, this geysering activity is vigorous enough to produce popping sounds audible from hundreds of feet away. The geysering usually lasts a few seconds and occurs at irregular intervals, with several minutes between eruptions. The unpredictability of this hazardous spring activity led the U.S. Forest Service to close parts of the Hot Creek geologic site in June 2006, and the closure has remained in effect to date, June 2007. The thermal springs in Long Valley caldera have long been known to Native Americans. Many of the hot springs have special status with Native American tribes and have been used for spiritual and medicinal purposes. Early written records of the springs came from visits by pioneers and scientists. USGS scientist G.A. Waring visited the thermal springs in Long Valley in 1908 and later wrote a paper describing hundreds of springs throughout California. The Hot Creek geologic site lies within the Long Valley caldera, a large topographic depression formed 760,000 years ago during a massive volcanic eruption that produced extensive and thick deposits of ash and pumice. A reservoir of partially molten rock, magma, beneath the caldera has produced subsequent volcanic eruptions. This activity formed many hills within the caldera, such as the 300,000-year-old Hot Creek rhyolite flow, known locally as Doe Ridge. The toe of that slow-moving lava entered a lake, where interaction with water altered the rhyolite and formed clay and perlite, a gray to black glassy material with a pearly luster, now exposed along the path from the parking area down into the gorge. After the lake receded, a stream cut into the steep-sided gorge through the toe of the solidified lava. This stream, known here as Hot Creek, begins its winding course some 11 miles, or 17 kilometers, to the west as Mammoth Creek, flowing through a series of small lakes west of the town of Mammoth Lakes. The stream water is derived primarily from melting snow as it leaves Twin Lakes, 8,500 feet, or 2,600 meters above sea level. It is quite cold, rarely above 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius. About 1.5 miles, 2.5 kilometers upstream from the thermal area, Mammoth Creek is joined by warmer water from thermal springs in the Hot Creek State Fish Hatchery. From this point on, the stream is named Hot Creek, even though the water temperature seldom exceeds 68 degrees Fahrenheit, 20 degrees Celsius, until it reaches the main thermal springs in the gorge. In hydrothermal, hot water systems, the circulation of groundwater is driven by a combination of topography and heat sources. The system in Long Valley caldera is recharged primarily from snowmelt in the highlands, around the western and southern rims of the caldera. The meltwater infiltrates to considerable depths, where some is heated to at least 430 degrees Fahrenheit, 220 Celsius, by hot rock near cooling magma beneath the Inyo craters and domes, 10 miles or 16 kilometers west of Hot Creek. This volcanic chain extends from the western part of Long Valley caldera northward to Mono Lake, and has produced numerous eruptions over the past 40,000 years. The latest only a few hundred years ago. The heated water from boiling by high pressure still has lower density than cold water, and it rises along steeply inclined fractures to depths of 0.3 to 1.25 miles, half to 2 kilometers. It then flows eastward through rock layers to a discharge point, at the surface along Hot Creek and around Crowley Lake. The water temperature decreases eastward because of heat loss and mixing with cold water. And in the springs near Crowley Lake, temperatures are only about 125 degrees Fahrenheit, 50 degrees Celsius. Okay, as with the last passage, we do have a main purpose of the passage question. And if you have a sense of how to answer that, you can, but I think we'll be able to answer it most confidently after we've answered all of the other questions. So let's just scan through which other ones we have. We have a vocab question, we have detail, according to the passage always, detail, detail. We have a reasonable inference question, the first one on this entire section, another reasonable inference, a third reasonable inference, a detail, and a purpose of a paragraph. Reasonable inference, I think, is common among these natural science passages, which is why we see 3 of them here and none of them in the previous passage. And the reason for this is that it really is about comprehension, right? These are the passages where it's hardest to answer the most basic question: what is happening in the passage? What is being said? Not what is the author inferring, what are some themes, there's no deeper analysis to be had here the way that there might be for social sciences or for humanities or for literary narrative even. This writing is normally very surface level, but that surface level is difficult to understand, especially because of the concepts that are being used. And that's why reasonable inference is what we are trying to work on here, and that's why you might see a lot of these with natural science passages. So as always, let's use some referential questions. Line 93, infiltrates. For a vocabulary question. Line 93, if we can just find it. Here it is. The meltwater infiltrates to considerable depths, where some is heated to at least 430 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, infiltrates. Well, obviously we have some answers like observes, right? The meltwater, this water cannot observe anything. That doesn't make any sense. Compromises also seems wrong. The water cannot compromise to considerable depths. There are sort of 2 understandings of the word compromise that you might use. One is sort of coming to an agreement between 2 people where you both sort of end up in a middle ground, right? One person compromises and they go up. One person compromises and they go down. They meet in the middle. That's not what's happening here. Water doesn't do that. Excuse me. So answer choice B seems totally wrong. Invades, again, seems to be totally wrong. You could imagine in a certain sense that the water would invade to depths, but that doesn't seem nearly as good as answer choice D, which says that it flows. Right? Water flowing to depths makes a lot of sense. I think that's exactly what we are trying to get at with this passage. Okay, let's make sure we don't have any other referential. Nope, we have reasonable inference and purpose of paragraph as referential questions, but no other vocabulary or purpose of phrase questions. So according to the passage, the Long Valley caldera we'll go on with our detailed questions. According to the passage, Long Valley caldera was what? Right? Was it formed before a large eruption, formed 760,000 years ago, or first formed in the 18th century, or a popular skiing destination? Well, for one thing, I think that we can eliminate answer choice C, because I remember that it's long been known to Native American tribes, which I think goes well before the 18th century. Being formed 760,000 years ago seems right. Let's see when that number came up. I do remember there being a 760,000. Aha. And again, we see this right here, 760,000 years ago. And we can find this if we think about our structure. Our structure is, we sort of first have this long line that's just sort of the basics about geysering, and about how geysering and this sort of hot springs thing starts to happen. This sort of the mechanism of geysering. Then we have this long time, big history, geologic formation of the Long Valley caldera and of hot springs. And then we have the hydrothermal system at the end. So we can know that, okay, when the Long Valley caldera was formed is going to be in the middle of the passage. We can look in the middle and find that the Long Valley caldera is a depression formed 760,000 years ago during a massive volcanic eruption. So we have to be tricky. I almost caught myself up here. Formed before a large eruption is really close to being the right answer. It's formed after a large eruption. So again, you need to remember, you can't just remember that it's something about a large eruption. You can't just remember that part. You actually need to go back into the passage and make sure you're right. Right? It was formed during a massive volcanic eruption. So you can't just remember that it has something to do with an eruption. You need to make sure you get this totally right. This is a tricky question that could have gotten me, actually, on a test. But formed 760,000 years ago is directly confirmed in the passage. In a popular skiing destination, well, we have one that's confirmed, so we can sort of eliminate everything. And at this point, I would definitely move on in the passage. But we can just sort of quickly eliminate it. It's hard to eliminate these sorts of answers because skiing just doesn't really come up. We know that the area has popular swimming, right? So it seems pretty unlikely that there's also skiing in the same place. Okay, according to the passage, rock fracturing happens because of what? Well, remember, our third part of our structure is about geysering, which happens because of rock fracturing, or is about the same stuff. Right, so we can come down here, the first part of our structure is about geysering. So we can just find where it says something about rock fracturing. If we quickly scan through the passage, fractures. We have fractures here, and fractures here. Larger and more vigorous springs flow from fractures in the volcanic rock, altered rhyolite, and Hot Creek Gorge. Fractures become sealed by mineral deposition, spring discharge, and temperature decline. New fractures develop and sealed fractures open, and spring discharge temperatures can rise suddenly, and this causes the geysering, ground deformation. Okay. But that becomes because of what? Rock fracturing happens because, we just needed to read another line further. Fracturing happens because the thermal area lies within a region of frequent earthquakes and ground deformation. So there's our answer. Rock fracturing happens because of earthquakes and deformation. That was a long question, I'll tell you. These detailed questions on natural science passages are going to be harder because, I explained I have a structure in my head that I think is pretty good, but the structure is going to be less clear, I think, than the other passage types, which is why some of these are very, very difficult to find. Okay, according to the passage, the main source of water for Mammoth Creek is what? Melting snow. So let's find Mammoth Creek. We have water systems and the hot springs, which are sort of discussed in the last part. I think we're sort of more up here. Here is our discussion of Mammoth Creek. And, okay, we see the stream water, right? Mammoth Creek, which is a stream. Stream water is delivered primarily from melting snow as it leaves Twin Lakes. Primarily from melting snow. There is answer choice A. This is another question that's also really difficult because you might read this and you might say that Mammoth Creek flows through a series of small lakes. And you might say, okay, Mammoth Creek is supplied by the lakes. and then you would come down here and realize that lake water is not one of the answer choices. You don't know that it is lake water. So you need to be careful. You need to be really careful about which parts of these you read. And once you've skimmed through this and figured out what you need to read it quickly and thoroughly, of course, but you need to read it. You need to read through the part that says melting snow is what provides the water for Mammoth Creek. But okay, question 16. It can be reasonably inferred. Oh man, is that all? Is that all of the detail questions? No, okay. According to the passage, all of the following were once popular activities in Hot Creek. Interesting. So, according to the passage, what are the popular activities at Hot Creek? Well, we remember that swimming was because we investigated whether skiing was before, and that all happens here, right, in this first part. I think the first part of our structure is what discusses what you might do here, right? So we see, okay, it's popular swimming. There are walkways that you can go to. And oh, the attractions of Hot Creek, even up here earlier. Fishing, swimming, hiking, bird watching, and photography. Okay, fishing, swimming, hiking, bird watching, and photography. And be careful, because this is an except, right? We need to make sure that we mark off all the correct answers and circle an incorrect answer, basically, right? So photography, swimming, bird watching were all correct answers. They were all popular activities. And the one that wasn't was hunting. Hunting was nowhere to be found. Okay, so we have a purpose of a paragraph question, we have a main purpose of the passage, and we have reasonable inference questions. And I think in this situation, it's best to do reasonable inference questions. Okay, so it can be reasonably inferred from the passage that the danger of Hot Creek is primarily due to earthquakes, popping sounds, mineral deposition, or unpredictable geysering. Well, for one thing, it seems like loud popping sounds and mineral deposition don't create a serious danger to the tourists at Hot Creek. They just sort of seem unlikely, and we know that there were loud popping sounds, but we don't know how dangerous they were. But to be honest, I don't recall whether it was the geysering or whether it was the earthquakes that caused the real issues. But I remember that in here we have this this section after, well, at the end when we start to discuss all this sort of geologic activity, where it discusses that they closed the park or the Hot Creek and started explaining why they did it. So, okay, springs in and near the most popular swimming areas have been geysering. At times, the geysering activity is vigorous enough to produce popping sounds. Okay. The unpredictability of this hazardous spring activity being the geysering, led the U.S. Forest Service to close parts of Hot Creek. Okay, so it's unpredictable geysering. That's our answer choice. Unpredictable geysering. Okay, so even though there were earthquakes, we need to make sure that it says explicitly which of our answer choices is correct, and it is unpredictable geysering. Okay, a reasonable inference based on the final paragraphs, lines 87 through the end. That one, water heats up as it flows east of Hot Creek. Heated water between the Inyo craters would boil as the surface at surface pressures. The water in Hot Creek would be hotter if not for cold springs near Cowley Lake. Or there will be more eruptions in the Long Valley caldera soon. Wow, okay. So this is going to be a very technical question. And it's quite a bit to read as well, lines 87 through 111. Which is this paragraph starting here and going all the way to the end here. Okay. So we know, speaking of Inyo craters and domes, the meltwater infiltrates to considerable depths where some is heated to at least 430 degrees Fahrenheit by hot rock near cooling magma beneath the Inyo craters and domes. Right. So it seems like heated water beneath the Inyo craters and domes would boil at surface pressures. Well, this seems right, you know? And this is, again, asking us to draw some amount of inference. But here we see the meltwater infiltrates to considerable depths and is heated to 430 Fahrenheit or 220 Celsius near the cooling magma beneath the Inyo craters and domes. Beneath the Inyo craters and domes. Notice also that it's west of Hot Creek, right? So one of our answer choices was as it flows east of Hot Creek. Well, we're going west, which is where it heats up. But anyway, the water is well above boiling, right? Water that is 430 or 220 degrees Celsius is well above boiling. Well above boiling. So we can know that it would boil at surface temperatures if it's at 430 Fahrenheit or 220 Celsius. So wow, that's a really tough question. It requires you to look at this particular part and realize where boiling is. Again, it's knowledge that everyone should have, but this inference does require you to really actively look at what is being presented. And to criticize it, to look at whether every part of it is right or not. And how all of the pieces fit together. Anyway, so let's look at these other answer choices and see and make sure that they're both wrong. The water in Hot Creek, of course, before I move on, I would not stick with an answer like this. I would not keep marking off answers if I had gotten something that I was confident in, like I am with answer choice B. But let's, for the purpose of explanation, look at answer choices C and D. The water in Hot Creek would be hotter if not for the cold springs near Crowley Lake. Okay, well, let's see if it says anything about Crowley Lake. It then flows eastward through rock layers to discharge point at the surface along Hot Creek and around Crowley Lake. Yeah, this just doesn't seem like a reasonable inference. And actually, it seems like when it mixes into this spring around Crowley Lake, it says it's actually much cooler than it was earlier on, right? 125 versus 430. It's much cooler. It doesn't seem like Crowley Lake is really cooling down the whole of Hot Creek. It sounds like the water has already cooled down by that point. So Crowley Lake is really not cooling down Hot Creek. There will be more eruptions in the Long Valley caldera soon. Well, for one thing, this seems like a reasonable inference from the passage, right? It does seem like frequent eruptions were a big risk. Were a big risk earlier on, and it's why they closed the park, or the parts of the park, or the swimming areas, whatever. But that doesn't seem to be any part of what's going on with this paragraph. This paragraph doesn't tell us when there will be eruptions, right? So that's just totally absent, and for that reason, I can mark it off. Okay, question 18. It can reasonably be inferred from the final two paragraphs. So wow, the paragraph we just read and the paragraph before it, that A, Mammoth Creek does not flow from a hydrothermal system. B, Mammoth Creek was hot before the Mammoth Lakes receded. C, no geysering occurs upstream of Mammoth Lakes. Or D, fracturing would prevent hydrothermal activity. So, okay, we've just read the last paragraph. Let's review the paragraph before the last one and make sure that we're not missing anything, which again starts way up here. So this is the second half, or even a little bit more of the passage. And this is in the second part of our structure. This is about um, well, this is about sort of these geologic events that formed the Long Valley caldera, and not necessarily specifically about the hydrothermal activities as the last paragraph is. So, okay. So we have the formation of the Long Valley caldera. We have this magma that was flowing. The lake recedes. And I think that this question is really about Hot Creek, so I think that we're moving toward this part, lines sort of 71 or 72. Hot Creek begins its winding course some 11 miles to the west of Mammoth Creek, flowing through a series of small lakes west of the town of Mammoth Lakes. Okay. It's quite cold. Then Mammoth Creek is joined by thermal springs in the fish hatchery, where it's named Hot Creek. Okay. And then we get the rest of our hydrothermal systems. Okay, so let's see if we have any sense of how we can answer this. And again, this question is already taking me a long time. I think I would skip it. To be honest, I think I would skip it and move on, even to the next passage at this point. But I do want to answer it for demonstration purposes. Mammoth Creek does not flow from a hydrothermal system. Yeah, that seems right. that seems right. I'm going to mark it just tentatively because it sounds like Mammoth Creek is just a creek from some lakes. And in fact, if we remember from our earlier question that Mammoth Creek is from melting snow, that's not a hydrothermal system. Okay, melting snow runoff is not a hydrothermal system. So I'm going to mark A actually much more confidently now. But okay, Mammoth Creek was hot before the Mammoth Lakes receded. It doesn't seem like Mammoth Creek was hot at any point. It's from snow runoff. C. No geysering occurs upstream of Mammoth Lakes. Well, it seems likely that there's no geysering upstream of Mammoth Lakes. It sounds like if it's not a hydrothermal system, we probably don't have the pressure and the hydrothermal system that creates this geysering. But we don't know about how far upstream Mammoth Lakes is, and we also only know that Mammoth Lakes is primarily and not entirely fed from snow runoff. So it's possible that there's some geysering very far upstream of Mammoth Lakes. We just don't have enough information to know that there isn't any, that there isn't any geysering at all upstream of Mammoth Lakes. And likewise with answer choice D, fracturing would prevent hydrothermal activity. We just don't really know. It sounds like hydrothermal activity actually causes fracturing and geysering. So to say that it would prevent something, right? To say that the cause of an effect would prevent, the effect of a cause would prevent the cause is very strange, right? It seems like hydrothermal activity comes first and then fracturing comes later. The idea that we could fracture something and then prevent hydrothermal activity doesn't make any sense. And is certainly not a reasonable inference from this last part of the passage. In fact, it doesn't say that much about fracturing. Fracturing happens much earlier in the passage, here in the first third. So, okay, we have two questions left. The second paragraph, lines 44 to 53, serves primarily to what? Okay, lines 44 to 53. So this is a nice short little paragraph, and we can read through it very quickly. And I think what we're hearing here is we're trying to discuss the history to the Native Americans and to G.A. Waring of the Long Valley caldera. Okay, that's what I think the purpose is. Let's see if we have that answer choice in the question. Explain the religious significance of the Hot Creek geologic site. Yeah, it seems like it's possible. Some historical context, that seems better. Name the person. Again, I don't think that's the primary purpose. I think it's to be historical. And clarify a point made in a preceding paragraph. This one is obviously out. B seems like the right answer, and I'll tell you why. The religious significance and to name the person who discovered the Hot Creek geologic site are both things that this passage does, I believe. Um, yes, it's been used for spiritual purposes, and here is the person who discovered it, G.A. Waring. So these are both two things that happen in this paragraph, but they're not the main purpose. Both of them are supporting points to this answer choice B, right? We're looking at historical context, and one component of historical context is religious significance, and one component of historical context is to name the person who discovered it. So I think answer choice B is the only one we can choose here. Okay, so now we get back around to the main purpose question. What are we talking about? Is it about the history? Well, again, history is discussed, but only in that one paragraph, right? Most of this is about the hydrothermal systems. It's about fracturing. It's about the geologic events, that led up to the formation of the Long Valley caldera. This is not just about the history. This is also about some scientific concepts and some events that take place and some sort of structures that cause things like geysering and that cause the Hot Creek. So it's not just history. Explore the geographic factors causing a safety concern. That seems pretty good. Explain the geographic factors causing a safety concern. It seems like, one of the things that we're trying to explain here is why it was closed, right? Why was it closed? Well, let's talk about everything that's going on with that. For one thing, we have this hydrothermal system, this geysering and the fracturing, which is caused by this big hydrothermal system that's been building for 760,000 years. And so it seems like the entire passage really leads up to these geographic factors and then explains why those geographic factors cause a safety concern. So I think that this is really the whole of the passage in a sentence. It's to explain the geographic factors causing a safety concern. Comparing Hot Creek and Mammoth Lakes, for one thing, it's sort of difficult to do because they're sort of the same. Mammoth Lakes flows into Hot Creek eventually, so the comparison, it happens when they compare the temperatures, but this is not the main purpose of the passage. This is a couple sentences, if that. And to discuss the chemistry of volcanic eruptions, well, I don't think there's any chemistry or any volcanoes at any point in this passage. Maybe a couple volcanoes, I don't know. But really, this is not about chemistry and volcanoes. This is about all of this geography that causes this safety concern. Okay, so there is our passage, and I think that is everything. Now we get to the passage that I think I would have started with. And to be honest, I think I would start with social sciences a lot of the time, because social science is an easy passage to read, frankly. It talks about real world things. You generally don't need to learn anything totally new, right? This passage is about the internet, and, I know a little bit about the internet. I don't know anything about the Ambersons or about Hot Creek, but I know something about the internet. And social science normally gives you a little bit of footing that helps you sort of understand from the get-go what's going on in the passage. You want to be careful. You definitely want to be careful about bringing your background knowledge into the ACT. You can't make assumptions. You can't answer questions based on what you already knew before the passage. You still need to find the answers in the passage. But I think that this is just easier to understand because it's talking about events and concepts that you already know a little bit about. So without further ado, let's get into this passage. Today's internet is not the only way to build a network. In the 1990s, the internet passed unnoticed in mainstream circles, while networks were deployed by competing proprietary barons such as AOL, CompuServe, and Prodigy. The Technorati placed bets on which baron would prevail over the others, apparently imagining that the proprietary networks would develop in the same way that the separate phone networks, at one time requiring differently colored phones on each person's desk, had converged to just one lucky provider. All those bets lost. The proprietary networks went extinct despite having accumulated millions of subscribers. They were crushed by a network built by government researchers and computer scientists who had no CEO, no master business plan, no paying subscribers, no investment in content, and no financial interest in accumulating subscribers. The framers of the internet did not design their network with visions of mainstream dominance. Instead, the very unexpectedness of its success was a critical ingredient. The internet was able to develop quietly and organically for years before it became widely known, remaining outside the notice of those who would have insisted on more cautious strictures had they only suspected how ubiquitous it would become. This first part of the book traces the battle between the centralized proprietary networks and the internet, and a corresponding fight between specialized information appliances like smart typewriters and the general purpose PC, highlighting the qualities that allowed the internet and PC to win. Today, the same qualities that led to their successes are causing the internet and the PC to falter. As ubiquitous as internet technologies are today, the pieces are in place for a wholesale shift away from the original chaotic design that has given rise to the modern information revolution. Understanding its history sheds light on different possible futures and helps us to recognize and avoid what might otherwise be very tempting dead ends. One vital lesson from the past is that the endpoint matters. Too often, a discussion of the internet and its future stops just short of its endpoints, focusing only on the literal network itself, how many people are connected, whether and how it is filtered, and how fast it carries data. These are important questions, but they risk obscuring the reality that people's experiences with the internet are shaped at least as much by the devices they use to access it. As internet-aware devices proliferate, questions posed about network regulation must also be applied to the endpoints, which, until recently, have been so open and so non-constricting as to be nearly unnoticeable, and therefore absent from most debates about internet policy. Yet increasingly, the box has come to matter. History shows that the box had competitors, and today they are back. The early models of commercial as compared to academic computing assumed that the vendor of the machinery would provide most or all of its programming. The PC of the 1980s, the parent of today's PC, diverged from these models, but the result was by no means a foregone conclusion. Internet users are again embracing a range of tethered appliances, reflecting a resurgence of the initial model of bundled hardware and software that is created and controlled by one company. This will affect how readily behavior on the internet can be regulated, which in turn will determine the extent that regulators and commercial incumbents can constrain amateur innovation, which has been responsible for much of what we now consider precious about the internet. The internet also had competitors, and they're back. Compared to the internet, early online information services were built around very different technical and business models. Their designs were much easier to secure against illegal behavior and security threats. The cost was that innovation became much more difficult. The internet outpaced these services by assuming that every user was contributing a goodwill subsidy. People would not behave destructively even when there were no easy ways to monitor or stop them. The internet's trade-off of more flexibility for less security worked. Most imaginable risks failed to materialize. For example, people did not routinely spy on one another's communications, even though it was eminently possible. And for years, there were no spam and no viruses. By observing at which point these trade-offs were made, we will see that the current portfolio of trade-offs is no longer optimal, and that some of the natural adjustments in the balance, while predictable, are also undesirable. The fundamental challenges for those who have built and maintained the internet are to acknowledge crucial deficiencies in a network and endpoint structure that has otherwise served so well for so long, to understand our alternatives as the status quo evaporates, and to devise ways to push the system toward a future that addresses the very real problems that are forcing change, while preserving the elements that we hold most dear. Okay, so we're cheating a little bit with this passage because we know what happened. We can understand that we are hearing about what happened in the internet in the 80s and 90s, right? We have a few crucial ideas, but our structure is going to be vaguely this, right? We have this introduction. We have this introduction that says, today's internet, we have other devices. We compare it to other parts of the internet, such as here. Then we start to see this point about endpoint, right? Devices, that the box matters, which goes through, I think, about line 83. And then finally, we talk about the competitors, and we have this little call to action about what we need to do, right? How do we acknowledge the deficiencies in the network and endpoint structure? So that's how I would broadly split up this passage. And of course, the first question is a main purpose question. We can answer that now if we really know it, but I'm going to come back to it at the end, as I like to do. Okay, so we have a vocab question, we have details, we have reasonable inference, we have details. We have another sort of detail-ish question. It's not exactly the same, but it's a detail question. A detail question, a vocabulary question, or excuse me, meaning of phrase question, a detail question, and a theme question. Theme questions are sort of strange when they're not the main theme, but hey, we do see them every once in a while on the ACT. So okay, let's look at our vocab question, which is in line 58, and it's the word posed. So line 58 in posed. Here it is. As internet-aware devices proliferate, questions posed about network regulation must also be applied to the endpoints. Okay, so questions posed. Questions posed. What can we do with questions? Can we stand questions? No. We're not talking about stood. We're also not talking about positioning questions or modeling questions. We're talking about raising questions, right? This is something that we can say, right? This raises the question of this, right? And we can also substitute it in, right? As internet-aware devices proliferate, questions raised about network regulation must also be applied to the endpoints. Yeah, that works for me. This is a very normal phrase that we might use. Okay, a detailed question. Actually, you know what? Let's do the meaning of phrase question. Let's do the meaning of phrase question because this is another referential question. Line 41. Original chaotic design. What does that refer to? In line 41. So here, here, if I can underline anything, here is the phrase. Ubiquitous internet technologies are today. The pieces are in place for a wholesale shift away from the original chaotic design that has given rise to the modern information revolution. Oh, the original chaotic design is this design about the internet, right? Here's the design. They didn't design, here's how they didn't design it, with mainstream dominance, right? The way that it was developed was with no security, right? The original design of the internet with no security. That's what we're talking about here. That's what we're talking about here. Okay, so the original chaotic design, not the first internet viruses. That's not discussed. Not early social networks. Social networks don't come up anywhere. No, we're talking about the unregulated internet, right? This totally, non-secure internet, and the personal computer, not a part of it. Although you would be forgiven for thinking that one was right. But the original chaotic design, let's just show you that it does mean the internet and not the computer. This is really what it is. As ubiquitous as internet technologies are today, a shift away from the chaotic design. You can see that we're talking about the design of this internet technologies. We're not talking about the PC. So, okay. I think those are the referential questions, aside from the reasonable inference questions, which actually are not even referential. So let's use these detail questions to get us started. Question 23. According to the passage compared to that of the 1990s, today's internet is what? Well, of course, it's less popular, right? That can't be right. Is more social. This is one that's going to punish you for bringing in your outside information. Obviously, the internet is more social today than it was in the 1990s or even 1980s, but that's not something that's discussed in this passage. The same way that social networks or early social networks aren't discussed, there's really nothing social about the internet. Is more secure? Well, I don't know that the passage is saying that it's more secure. Again, this actually looks more like a detail question, but it ends up being more like a theme question, to be honest, in the content, because we need to look at all of these different pieces, whether they are themes in the passage. But okay, is no longer proprietary seems right. It seems like it's not more secure. It seems like the passage is actually a call to action to make it more secure, but it doesn't seem like it's more secure right now. No longer proprietary seems like the right answer, but let's find it in the passage. What we know is that it's changed, right? We originally had this idea that we're like phone companies, right? Right? We originally had this idea that they were imagining the proprietary networks would develop in the same way as phone networks, right? But all of those lost, right? The proprietary networks went extinct. They went extinct. That's what we're looking for. The internet is no longer proprietary. And it's not more secure. This is sort of a call to action. So this question reads like a detail question, but it ends up being more of a theme question. You actually have to look all over this passage to find all of these things, or to find, counterpoints to all of these answer choices. It can be reasonably inferred from the passage that spam and virus is what? I remember from the passage that it said, we didn't have spam and viruses even though we could, right? When we were talking about early points about security, we realized that even though we could, excuse me while I try to find this, even though we could have, I guess it's at the end, right? Huh. I'm just having trouble finding this. I'm going to have a really hard time finding this. Okay, so let's read through the answer choices and see what happens. From the passage that spam and viruses are more recent than the advent of the internet. Well, I think this is obvious. I think this is obviously the right answer, and the passage does not even need to help us with this. Oh, shit. So moving on to the next detailed question. According to the passage, one lesson from the past is that A, it's unwise to invest in competing businesses that will later merge. B, one should always assume that people will behave in a constructive manner. C, internet endpoints are important to security. Or D, people will sacrifice security if given enough reason to do so. My immediate impression is C. D is definitely not right. D is not right because the passage is talking about increasing security. We're not increasing security, right? We're not sacrificing security. We're increasing it. We're bringing about this idea that we need to have more security. So D is definitely not right. And B also seems wrong. If we need to increase security, well, assuming that people will be constructive is not how we act, is not how we think if we need to increase security. Whether this investment choice is wise or not doesn't seem to be part of the passage, right? The passage doesn't seem to be talking about investment strategy. It seems like it's about internet endpoints. I think that's one thing that it really does want to talk about. But let's find it in the passage. I believe it's right here. In fact, it is, right? One vital lesson from the past is that the endpoint matters, right? The endpoint matters. And we're talking about the internet endpoint. Of course, a discussion of the internet and its future stops just short of endpoints, focusing only on the literal network. Okay, so endpoint matters for security. I like it. Okay, so we have one that's sort of a detailed question, but let's move on to this question 27 because it's a more traditional detailed question. It's an easier one. According to the passage, the PC of the 1980s assumed users would mostly use third-party software, was protected against threats such as viruses, was a secure endpoint, or was the parent of current computers. Well, this seems pretty easy, right? The answer that jumps out to you should be answer choice D, right? The PC of the 80s was the parent of current computers. Well, that almost seems obvious, right? That seems like we don't even need to read the passage. But I know that all of these other answer choices are also wrong, right? We remember from the passage that these endpoints weren't secure. And if they weren't secure, that is the same thing as not being protected against threats such as viruses, right? These are equivalent answer choices. Wow, forgive my handwriting. These are equivalent answer choices, B and C. And assuming that most users would use third-party software, is directly contradicted, right? If we want to talk about the early vision, they thought everything was going to be proprietary, right? They thought that third-party software would be pretty unlikely. Right, so when we talk about the box, we see that we thought they were going to be tethered appliances, right? Bundled hardware and software that was created and controlled by one company. So that's not using third-party software, right? That is using the manufacturer's software. Okay, another detailed question, question 29. According to the passage, competitors of the internet offer higher security but more difficult innovation, were entirely unviable, assumed the goodwill of every user, or have completely died out. Well, it doesn't sound like they were entirely unviable. if you remember this point about competitors of the internet, they actually had millions of subscribers, but they went extinct, right? So they were viable, but they still went extinct. Right? They weren't entirely unviable. They went extinct in the words of the passage, meaning they have completely died out, which is another way to say it. Assuming the goodwill of every user is something that the current internet does, but we don't know actually what the security standards of the internet's competitors were. We don't know whether they protected anyone against viruses or not. We just don't know. The passage doesn't say. And the same way that we don't know the answer to, well, we don't know whether answer choice C is right, we also don't know whether answer choice A is right. Offering higher security but more difficult innovation, we don't know how they stacked up in terms of security. These old things that have all died out, we just don't really know. We know that they were proprietary and we know that they were backed by all of these CEOs, but we don't know how those networks were designed. So, okay, we have 3 questions left. We have a theme question, we have this detail question, which I think is our next one, and then we have 4 questions. We have a reasonable inference question and a main purpose question. So let's get into this last detail question. The contemporary internet can best be described as divided and complicated, risk-laden and unstable, profitable and expanding, or unpredictable yet optimal. Well, for one thing, divided and complicated seems wrong. From what we just looked at, it's not divided anymore. We have one unified internet. We don't have a bunch of different proprietary internets. Profitable and expanding is sort of a trap, right? You probably have some inkling that the internet is pretty profitable. But this does not talk about it. This passage does not talk about how profitable it is. It talks about how many people get into it, right? We learned that more users are able to use it, as in these later paragraphs, but we don't understand anything about profit. So profit is not quite right. Unpredictable yet optimal. Optimal is really the sticking point here. Does the author really want to say that the internet is optimal? Well, I don't think so. Because we are supposed to acknowledge crucial deficiencies in a network and endpoint structure, right? This call to action, and actually the whole passage is about this call to action. This whole passage is saying, look what we need to change about the internet, really doesn't make me think that the internet is optimal, right? Actually, we need to change a bunch of stuff about the internet means the internet is not optimal. It has problems. Risk-laden and unstable seems right. Risk-laden and unstable seems like well, first of all, for risk-laden, there are lots of security risks. That's what that means, plain and simple. And unstable means that the market of the internet is unstable, right? The future of it is unpredictable. We don't know what lies in the future of the internet. The competition for the internet has been there. It's still going to be there, perhaps. So it's unstable. We don't know what the future holds, and we don't know what the technologies are going to be or what the culture around them are going to be. Okay, let's answer this theme question because, non-main theme, but nonetheless, theme questions tend to be pretty easy, right? These are just about what is found in the passage and what isn't. And now that we've reviewed a lot of the passage, we probably don't need to look back to answer these questions. So, okay, the internet is dying, even if that fact is difficult to recognize. No, obviously not. Obviously not. We talk about this current internet growing really fast. It's not dying. One must shift one's priorities to accommodate the status quo. That doesn't seem exactly like what we're saying. It doesn't sound like we're accommodating the status quo. It sounds like we are trying to have precaution, right? We are trying to put up some protections so that if people want to build viruses and they want to attack people over the internet, that they can't. This isn't protect to accommodating the status quo. We're not shifting our priorities. We've always cared about security. We've always cared about security. It's just that it wasn't as much of a concern before, right? If it had been an issue, if people had been attacking us, we would have prioritized it. It would have been one of our priorities. So I don't think this is right. It being wise to prepare for people to behave maliciously seems right. And this especially seems right in light of this part of the passage that just says that, we just sort of assumed that endpoints were not going to be secure and that it wouldn't matter. That this original chaotic design, right, that we talked about before, with no security, we just sort of assumed that people wouldn't. But that was sort of unwise, right? Now we have viruses, now we have all this sort of spying, and that's not good. So it's wise to prepare for people to behave maliciously even if they don't. That's what the passage is saying. And the internet is growing too quickly to understand it fully. It's just not being said here, right? It's not saying that we don't understand the internet. It's saying we need to do some things about how the internet is changing, but we can keep up with the speed of the internet changing. Okay, 24. It can reasonably be inferred from the passage that spam and viruses what? It seems like, okay, are more recent than the advent of the internet. This this answer choice almost marks itself correct if we really think about it. And let's really think about what it means. Well, could there be a virus, an internet virus in this case, that occurred before the internet? Well, no, obviously not. That's nonsense. There were no internet viruses before the internet. They have to come after the internet. So saying that viruses are more recent than the advent of the internet obviously has to be true. Obviously has to be true. And it obviously has to be a reasonable inference. Saying whether they're ubiquitous or cutting edge or whether they can be spread through other internet service providers simply isn't mentioned. We don't have a comparison of internet service providers. We don't know whether they are cutting edge or crude, and we don't know if they're ubiquitous or fairly uncommon, right? These are just things that we don't know from the passage. And this seems like an obvious answer, and I know I personally and a lot of people have, a little bit of reluctance to answer questions with the obvious ones. But really, sometimes the obvious answers are the ones that are the only ones that can be right. Especially in this case, it's so dead obvious that internet viruses came after the advent of the internet, right? That there couldn't have been the opposite. The opposite could not be true. There could not have been internet viruses and spam before the internet. And so the passage obviously has to at least imply that this is true. Okay, now we can get around to the main purpose, which is A, to describe the security of the early internet, B, outline security problems with the structure of today's internet, C, stress the importance of secure endpoints, or D, compare various internet networks. Well, it's not really a history lesson, right? We know a little bit about the early security, but it's not about the early internet. It's about moving forward. It's about problems that we have now and how we solve them, right? And this is really what we're talking about, right? The main purpose is to look at these security problems. And at the very end of the passage, we start to get a sense of, that the author is going to talk about how to solve them. But we're really looking at the problems, right? And one of the problems is secure endpoints. But this is a supporting point to answer choice B. Comparing various internet networks barely happens. right? There's some mention that there are other internet networks, but this is not the main purpose of the entire passage. The main purpose is to look at all of these security problems. Okay, passage 4. Final passage, which is adapted from Elizabeth Cady Stanton's Seneca Falls keynote speech. Very nice speech. I'm expecting some good writing here, but let's see what we have going for us. We have met here today to discuss our rights and wrongs, civil and political, and not, as some have supposed, to go into detail of social life alone. We do not propose to petition the legislature to make our husband just, generous, and courteous, to seat every man at the head of the cradle, and to clothe every woman in male attire. None of these points, however important they may be considered by leading men, will be touched in this convention. As to their costume, the gentlemen need feel no fear of our imitating that, for we think it in violation of every principle of taste, beauty, and dignity. Notwithstanding all the contempt cast upon our loose flowing garments, we still admire the graceful folds and consider our costume far more artistic than theirs. Many of the nobler sex seem to agree with us in this opinion, for the bishops, priests, judges, barristers, and lord mayors of the first nation of the globe, and the Pope of Rome, with his cardinals too, all wear the loose flowing robes, thus tacitly acknowledging that the male attire is neither dignified nor imposing. But we are assembled to protest against a form of government existing without the consent of the governed, to declare our right to be free as man is free, to be represented in the government which we are taxed to support, to have such disgraceful laws as give man the power to chastise and imprison his wife, to take the wages which she earns, the property which she inherits, and, in case of separation, the children of her love, laws which make her the mere dependent on his bounty. It is to protest against such unjust laws as these that we are assembled today, and to have them, if possible, forever erased from our statute books, deeming them a shame and a disgrace to a Christian republic in the 19th century. We have met to uplift woman's fallen dignity upon an even pedestal with man's, and, strange as it may seem to many, we now demand our right to vote according to the declaration of the government under which we live. This right no one pretends to deny. We need not prove ourselves equal to Daniel Webster to enjoy this privilege, for the ignorant Irishman in the ditch has all the civil rights he has. We need not prove our muscular power equal to this same Irishman to enjoy this privilege, for the most tiny, weak, ill-shaped stripling of a 21 has all the civil rights of the Irishman. We have no objection to discuss the question of equality, for we feel that the weight of the argument lies wholly with us. But we wish the question of equality kept distinct from the question of rights, for the proof of the one does not determine the truth of the other. All white men in this country have the same rights, however they may differ in mind, body, or estate. The right is ours. Have it we must. Use it we will. The pens, the tongues, the fortunes, the indomitable wills of many women are already pledged to secure this right. The great truth that no just government can be formed without the consent of the governed, we shall echo and re-echo in the ears of the unjust judge, until by continual coming we shall weary him. The world has never yet seen a truly great and virtuous nation, because in the degradation of woman the very fountains of life are poisoned at their source. It is vain to look for silver and gold from mines of copper and lead. It is the wise mother that has the wise son. So long as your women are slaves, you may throw your colleges and churches to the winds. You can't have scholars and saints so long as your mothers are ground to powder between the upper and nether millstone of tyranny and lust. How seldom now is father's pride gratified, his fond hopes realized in the budding genius of his son. We do not expect our path will be strewn with the flowers of popular applause, but over the thorns of bigotry and prejudice will be our way, and on our banners will beat the dark storm clouds of opposition from those who have entrenched themselves behind the stormy bulwarks of custom and authority, and who have fortified their position by every means, holy and unholy. But we will steadfastly abide the result. Unmoved, we will bear it aloft. Undauntedly, we will unfurl it to the gale, for we know that the storm cannot rend from it a shred, that the electric flash will but more clearly show to us the glorious words inscribed upon it, equality of rights. So a very different type of passage for this one. But the type of thing that you will see in humanities, the type of thing that you will see, you could see a speech, you could see sort of a historic text like this, is very much in line with what you might see. Maybe this is a little bit more difficult to read and to comprehend, but this is certainly in line with that. And I think if you're prepared for this, then you will certainly be prepared for the ACT. So let's go through our questions. We have a main purpose question, of course, author's purpose of paragraph. We have a detail question, the author's comparison. We have a vocabulary question. We have a meaning of phrase question. We have another detail question, again, a comparison. A detail question, purpose of paragraph question, detail question, and a reasonable inference question, but this time from a very short paragraph. So, okay, let's start with some vocabulary questions and the meaning of phrase questions. So, line 53, the word wait is what we're going for. First of all, line 53, wait. We have no objection to discuss the question of equality, for we feel that the weight of argument lies wholly with us. There's the clause that we're really looking at. There's a comma there, but there's the clause. The weight of argument lies wholly with us. Again, we're not talking about mass, right? We're not talking about the literal meaning of the word weight. Nor are we talking about feeling, right? We're not talking about that we feel a weight upon us, emotional or physical. What we're talking about is responsibility, right? What we're saying here, or what Stanton is saying here, is that it's our responsibility to argue. The weight of the argument is our responsibility to field an argument, or it's our responsibility to make an argument here. That's really what we're saying. And if we substitute it back, for we feel that the responsibility of argument lies wholly with us, it makes perfect sense. Again, we have a referential question. Line 26, the phrase the governed. So line 26 is right here, and here is the governed. We are assembled to protest against a form of government existing without the consent of the governed. Right. To declare our right to be free as man is free, to be represented in a government which we are taxed to support. So what we are understanding here is that we're asking for the right to vote, right? Women are asking for the right. I'm not asking for the right to vote. Women in the 19th century are asking for the right to vote. And so consent of the governed here is discussing the right to vote. You are governed by your consent by voting. So governed here means women, right? The whole thing is about suffrage. It's about women's right to vote. The entire passage, I would say, at least in part. So this comparison to men who are allowed to vote and women who at the time are not allowed to vote, is saying that men are governed by their consent in that they do vote for various governmental actions, but women do not. So it's not talking about Americans because Americans can vote, some of them, or Irish Americans, some Irish Americans can vote, nor even the working class. The point is that the working class can vote, right? She says specifically, um, that there's no difference. They all have the same rights in estate or mind or body, right? So it doesn't matter how big their estate is. It doesn't matter if they're working class or incredibly wealthy. So we stick with women. She's referring to women. So, okay, we have some detailed questions, some comparisons. The author compares progress toward women's rights to what? And if we remember, it is going to be something in here, a path or a road. I don't remember which, to be honest. Clothing is discussed, but it wasn't as progress toward a right, or flowers. My recollection is that it had to do with the path or the road not being strewn with flowers. Excuse me. So, let's find this part. If we remember, well, it's conveniently right here. It's hard not to read it, because this passage is so well organized. To be honest, it's easy to find these things, but we know where it's going to be because it's not about this introductory material, which is saying why are we here, right? It's saying what can we expect, right? Here's the issue. Here's why we're here. What can we expect? Which is this last little bit. Well, I'll tell you what we don't expect. We don't expect our path will be strewn with the flowers of popular applause. So it's not even about flowers. It's about the flowers of popular applause. But in any case, we do not expect our path will be strewn with flowers. So this is a case where you might think these are equivalent answer choices, but the fact of the matter is path is mentioned in the passage and road is not. And you won't see this too often on the ACT, but it might come up. You might have to make sure that you're not confusing a road for a path. Another comparison detail question is the author compares the treatment of women to houses, churches, colleges, or millstones. And if we remember this extremely vivid image that the author of the passage draws, is this one about the millstone, right? It is the wise mothers that have the wise son. Okay. You can throw your colleges and churches to the winds, right? So she's not comparing women to colleges and churches. She's not saying you can throw women to the winds. So it's not churches and it's not colleges, right? You can't have scholars and saints as long as you have mothers. As long as your mothers are ground to powder between the upper and nether millstones of tyranny and lust. So so the treatment of women is being compared to millstones here. Moving on to the next detailed question, the rights of white men, have no bearing on their participation in education, inadequate to function in a democracy, differ depending on ownership of property, are equal regardless of differences between them. And if we remember from our little aside, when we were discussing what it means to be the governed, and how we're not discussing anything about class or race or ancestry or nationality, we remembered that all white men in this country have the same rights, however they may differ in mind, body, or estate. So we've already seen this before. We already remember where to look back. The rights of white men are equal regardless of the differences between them, right? Mind, body, or estate. That's pretty much everything. Again, estate means property. They don't differ based on property. There's no criticism about their rights and their function in democracy. And there's also no discussion of men participating in education and their right to participate in education. That's simply not a claim that's made in the passage. Let's move on and see if we have any detailed questions. And it seems like we have one more. According to the passage, a critical issue of the government, is what we're looking for. A, rules over women without the consent of women. Aha! Well, we know this is true. Only rules over women without their consent. Because we understood this question 35 and the phrase "the governed" in line 26, now we immediately have the answer to question 39. Pretty cool. But okay, let's make sure that none of this comes up. Only address fiscal issues and the expense of social issues. This seems like some 21st century politics. To be honest, I don't recall fiscal issues or any sort of monetary policy coming up at all, right? I don't think it's the thing that happens. Does not separate church and state. Well, to be honest, the author does not seem to have an issue with the church. In fact, it seems that she gives some, for lack of a better word, some reverence to the church. She seems to have a lot of respect for certain members of the church. It doesn't seem like she's really calling for separation of church and state. And immigrants, likewise, are not discussed, right? We don't hear anything about immigrants. We hear about white men versus women. This is sort of the two sides of the issue that we hear discussed in the passage. We don't hear much about immigrants. Not that this wasn't an issue, it's just not mentioned in the passage. So, okay, what do we have left? We have reasonable inference. We have purpose of paragraph. We have purpose of paragraph again, and main purpose. So let's look at reasonable inference starting from lines 1 through 7, so right at the top. Let's review lines 1 through 7. Right. Okay, so we're just introducing it, right? We're not trying to make our husbands just, generous, and courteous, but here's what we're not trying to do, right? In essence, that's how I would describe this first paragraph. So, okay, and actually, this is an interesting point. Believes women's rights have an effect on men's rights. It seems like she's saying the opposite. She's saying, we're not trying to make you do anything differently with yourselves, right? You can still wear what you want. You don't have to be just or generous. We're just asking for something. You can go on doing you. So A seems right. A seems wrong, She's not asking for that. The author does not care about social issues regarding women. Well, that's not reasonably inferred from any part of this passage. We can remember there's no way to infer that. C does not find many arguments by leading men to be compelling. This seems right. This seems totally right, actually. Because she's saying, some have supposed to go into the detail of social life. We do not propose to petition the legislature to make our husbands, just, generous, and courteous, to seat every man in the head of the cradle, or to clothe every. So, this seems right. We're not trying to change the minds or discuss rights and wrongs of the whole political system, or to make men change, right? So, it sounds like this first part of the paragraph is designed to what you might describe as parry objections, right? We're trying to say, look, here is what leading men might try to say, and in fact she does say, none of these points, however important they may be considered by leading men, will be touched in this convention, right? She's saying these points made by leading men, we're not talking about them. We don't really care about them. They think they're important, but we're not going to talk about them. So to me, it seems pretty clear that she's saying that she does not find many arguments by leading men to be compelling. Again, that she finds male attire silly and wishes it would change. Well, we don't know if she says it's silly. We know she doesn't wish it would change, right? She's saying, I'm not asking you to change anything, right? We're not, as it says here, we are not trying to clothe every woman in male attire. And we're not, excuse me, well, we're not asking to change women's clothes. It doesn't say anything to change about men, right? We're not changing men's clothes at all. So that's totally out. So the right answer must be C. This was sort of a tough one, right? Because the real key to the answer is these first few sentences of the next paragraph. But you can sort of get this from this sort of gist of it from the lines of the first paragraph. Okay, only a few questions left. We have purpose of paragraph and purpose of paragraph again. So the final paragraph, what is the final paragraph for? What does it say? We do not expect our path to be easy. Right, we've already read this, but we're going to keep doing it anyway. We're going to do what we have to do for equal rights. That's really what it says. Stress the importance of perseverance in general. I don't think it's really about that. I don't think it's about perseverance in all endeavors, right? It's about perseverance in this particular case. Emphasizing women's determination toward gaining rights seems like it's exactly right. That's what we're going for. She's saying women are not going to give up, or we are not going to give up on women's rights. Again, questioning the role of religion. Religion is not anywhere at all in this paragraph. Or introduce a new set of goals for women. No, this really seems like the logical conclusion for the entire passage, right? This is not a new set of goals. This is the goal that we've been developing. We've been discussing it the entire time. So, okay, I like, excuse me, I marked these correct, but they are not. C and D are wrong, and I think B is the right answer. So only 2 questions left in the entire passage. Let's do the main purpose of the second paragraph. And remember, we're not saying that men need to change their clothes, but let's say, there's nothing particularly special about men's clothes. is what she seems to want to say. Actually, lots of people, lots of men, bishops, priests, judges, barristers, mayors, all wear these long flowy robes that look more like women's clothes than men's, at least normally. Right? That's really one of the things that she's trying to say. And I think that's really what we're going for, is we're discussing what you wear as sort of a conduit to another point, right? Right, we're still saying we could do this, right? You can, right? But this point that she's making is like, men wear, long flowy clothes like women do, and men also wear, pants, right? I think is the point she's making. So she's not criticizing equal rights among men, but she's distinguishing between women's rights and equality. Right? She's distinguishing between women's rights and equality. And I'll get back to exactly how that's right, but let's remove some of these other answers. We know that we're not talking about wages. Wages do not come up in this paragraph. And we know that religion is really not the centerpiece of this paragraph. What we're doing is we're distinguishing between rights and equality. What she's saying is we're not trying to make women indistinguishable from men, right? If you're saying this is what equality is, we're not trying to do that. We want to have the right to wear what we want. We want to have the right to vote, but we're not looking for equality necessarily. If we look at this paragraph in context, we see we're not trying to change clothes. We're not trying to do all of these other little things. What we're trying to do is protest against the government that doesn't allow us to vote. That's really what we get from these few lines. So we're not necessarily saying equality and, inability to tell the difference between men and women. What the author is saying here is, let's make sure we have the right to vote, right? Equality or not. What we're looking for is the right. We're not looking for equality necessarily in this instance. And this is really a finicky point. You can get there by process of elimination easily because A, C, and B are definitely not right. But really understanding how B is correct in its own right is sort of a difficult task. I'll give it to you. If you have trouble with this one, I think that makes sense. This might be the hardest question on the entire test. Because this point of distinction between rights and equality is one that we don't really discuss today, right? This is a case where you're punished for bringing in your own outside knowledge, where we don't really distinguish between rights and equality, and where if you really just look at what is being said, you're not going to quite get there. You really need to read into it, and you need to see the structure from this paragraph. Excuse me, that's a horrible line. You need to see the structure from this paragraph to this paragraph to this paragraph. And you need to see that what we're building up to is, here's what we want. There are a lot of things that you might think that we want, and those things might look like equality, right? Equality, to have like total evenly distributed responsibilities between men and women, right? As we sort of discuss in this first paragraph. But no, if we really look at what this paragraph is trying to do, is it's trying to sit in between one image of equality, and the author's particular idea of what rights are worth fighting for. So, a very long explanation, but what we see here is that there is a difference between equality and rights as far as the author is concerned. And in fact, it seems like rights might make up equality, but what she's saying is we're not asking for all equality all at once. We're asking for one right, and we're going to stay focused on that. So, okay, let's move on finally to question 31. The main purpose of the passage is most nearly to what? Explore the social problems of women faced at the time. Seems sort of right, but not exactly. It seems like it's in the right vein, but it's not exactly right. Comparing the rights of men and women, again, it's something it does, but it's not exactly right. We're not really saying, let's look at A and B and do a little compare and contrast. We're actually making an argument here. We're not saying this is different from that because of this. We're saying, here's what we want and why, which is a different sort of passage than just comparing things. And again, describing the intentions and the determination of those in the women's rights movement seems to be what is going on here, right? We're not arguing against women's rights to vote. I just read this. This is right out. But to describe the intentions and determination of those involved in the women's rights movement, this pretty much seems right. We're looking for the right to vote, and we're looking at exactly what the intentions are. Okay, do we want any of this stuff? Is this all what we want? Again, the image of equality that we discussed earlier, we're getting at a much finer and much more detailed idea of what the intentions are. What the rights look like of women. And like, look, what we are actually arguing for is described in a much greater detail throughout the passage. And it does get down to the rights to vote, but the intentions and the determination seems to be the main purpose. Of course, we could write this idea of intentions, right? We could ask, what are the intentions? Well, the intentions are to have the right to vote first and foremost. And that's where you might get a little bit tripped up. But if we really look at this answer choice, it is totally right. and explore the social problems faced by women at the time. Again, it's not really an exploration. It's it's really not. It's discussing what we're going to do about those social problems. What do we want? What is the solution? The solution is the right to vote. So this answer choice really misses a lot of the passage. So that about wraps up the passage. I think that is every question on the entire thing. I hope this helps. I hope that this has given you some sense about how you can answer the questions on the reading section, as well as how you can approach it strategically. Not just the thought process that goes into individual questions, but also the thought process behind how you want to approach the entire passage. As always, you can see more worksheets like this, more full sections on my website, greataspirationsprep.org, as well as full instructional videos for this sort of thing and walkthroughs exactly like this one on my YouTube channel, Great Aspirations Prep. I hope this helps. Best of luck with all of your test preparation, and I hope to catch you all in the next video. Take care.